Welcome to Leadership Explored, the podcast where we dive into what it means to lead in today's world. Every episode, we tackle different aspects of leadership, sometimes focusing on practical strategies, other times exploring deeper topics like human behavior, culture, and ethics. No matter the industry, our conversations are about helping you navigate challenges, inspire others, and lead with purpose. Remote work, remote-first cultures, and hybrid work models. These aren't new concepts, but they've been at the center of leadership conversations over the last few years. Some companies have embraced them fully, while others are struggling or outright rejecting remote work and calling employees back to the office. But here's the thing, successful remote work doesn't just happen. You can't just lift and shift your in-office work culture into a virtual space and expect it to work. Remote first is a deliberate act. It requires intentionality, structure, and a shift in how we think about communication, collaboration, and culture. So today we're going to unpack what makes a remote first environment actually work. What are the biggest challenges? What do companies need to do differently? And what's the real key to making remote work successful? Andy, before we get into some of the strategies that make remote work actually work, I want to start with a fundamental question. Do you think most organizations that went remote during the pandemic actually became remote first? Or did they just go remote without adjusting how they work?
Am I allowed to just be blunt here, Ed, without an opportunity for nuance and explanation, and just say hard no? Um,
I mean, you
I
can, but
feel
I
like
think the nuance would be helpful.
yeah, I feel like that would go against the general vibe that we like to have for these conversations. But I do not think that most, right? So that's the key part of your question is, did most organizations actually become remote first? I think the answer is no. I think that we're seeing the evidence play out in a couple of different ways. The most obvious is the return to office trend that we're starting to see, or at the very least, these return to hybrid sort of workflows that we're seeing across organizations, across industries. That being said, I do think that remote work is one of those things that's like toothpaste, right? You can't really put it back in the tube once you've let it out. So I think a lot of organizations are still struggling with that and still trying to figure out what it means to be remote or to be distributed, and how that impacts workflows, how that impacts culture, and what they need to do within their work culture in order to be successful. So Ed, I'm going to push this back to you. What have you seen be successful, or as like a leading practice in migrating to remote for first work? And this, this can be simple actions. We don't need to solve all of the remote work problems in a single question here.
Yeah, well, I mean, and I will abstract it out a bit. So first, I'll say that I agree with you, and I would say most organizations did not transition into remote first culture or actually respond to the pandemic in a meaningful way with their changes to their culture or behaviors or strategies. I think the companies that are thriving remotely, whether that's ones that did transition or had already been in fully distributed models, they aren't just working from home. They've actually designed their whole work culture around remote work. Um, and I think that is maybe my short answer, and my abstracted answer to your question is I think the only thing that you can really do is be intentional about it, whether that's about how you communicate, how you see each other, how you interact. And I know we're going to dive into some of these topics in a lot more detail, but I think that is really what it comes down to is understanding. I mean, we've talked about models a lot, and all models are wrong. Some models are useful, but you need to understand where and how a model is wrong, or where and how it's useful to be able to pick and choose the right model. And I think it's the same kind of idea with remote work. If you understand what makes it hard, or what makes it better or easier, or those types of things, and then you lean into those things, and take that intentional action. I think that's probably how we get there. Because if your meetings were bad before, they're gonna still be bad. right?
Yeah, you
So
just get to take those meetings while wearing pajama pants instead of real pants. That's that's the only upside.
yeah. So I mean, what do you think? Do you think is remote work actually harder, or is it just the same problems that already existed just being amplified?
I think it's more the latter. I think it's the same problems that existed being amplified. I do think that there are unique challenges to remote work. I don't want to get into the holy wars of, is remote work or in-person work better. I just think that they're objectively different, and there are headwinds to both. And I like what you called out before, right? That you have to be deliberate about structuring that remote work, or really, the way I would think of it is steering into the skid, right? So trying to maximize the upsides and minimize the downsides. I think we had this as part of another conversation earlier, but in my experience, at least, the bar for bad is just higher for remote work, meaning that, like, a bad meeting in person is less bad than that exact same meeting happening over Zoom, right? So there's just like a little bit less room for lack of preparation, lack of vibe, if you will. Like, you have to be just more deliberate about the collaboration aspects. You have to be more deliberate about the preparation of those meetings, especially if you're talking about larger groups, when you are making things remote, right? Like, think of, an all hands, if you've ever had the chance to actually be in the room with the CEO speaking as opposed to just on the Zoom cast, it's a totally different thing. I think that scales down.
Yeah.
So why don't we kind of get into it? So the 800-pound gorilla in the room is that about 5 years ago, all of us became unexpectedly remote, right? Talking about the COVID-19 pandemic, when pretty much every white collar person was asked to stay at home. You and I were working together at that point. I'm curious, you know, to me, in hindsight, I think we did a pretty darn good job of transitioning. But I'm curious what your thoughts were, and what you think were tailwinds for the group that we were working with, and potential headwinds, things that you might do differently if you were in the middle of a migration, like we were at that point.
Yeah. Well, I think with that team, we were it was still an early team. The whole team wasn't
Mhm.
really constructed yet. A few people had been with the company for a while, but otherwise it was mostly new people or hiring to staff up the team. So,
I think our most recent team member was like a week on the team or something like that,
yeah,
if
and then
I'm not
sitting in an
mistaken.
interview. So, if we think about Tuckman's model of team, the teams changing over time and everything, we could say that by being in that forming stage when that was happening, we were able to norm around being remote, um, and have that already be part of the cadence, which I do think did happen to some extent, and we built some things in that made it pretty good. We had sometimes we had those early morning meetings that weren't just a stand up, but had some extra time tacked on for just team building and chatting and coffee talk time. Um, I think we sometimes did that in the afternoon too. At the end of the day, we do some
Mhm.
of those in the middle. We had a few like happy hours or game nights, and those are kind of the team building and relationship building stuff. But then I think we also had a lot of energy and time, given the nature of the work we were doing for teams, like facilitating for teams and things like that. We did have a lot of time to think about meeting design, think about how to take do workshops online, or um, some of those kind of things. So I think that gave us a lot of headwinds in making good progress there.
Mhm.
Um, but I don't know. Ultimately, for me, like my Miro boards today are not nearly as good as my Miro boards were back then. And I don't know if that's because I found the efficiencies and figured out where to spend the time and where I haven't, or if it's because I had a lot more like excitement and energy around doing that early on, and lost some of that. It's a little hard to say with the remote culture. So, yeah, I mean, I think we did a good job, but there's relationship building was still a challenge, and it wasn't within our
Hmm.
team, but in that organization, there was a lot. I had not met anybody basically in person
Hmm.
aside from some people on our team, and there was a few people I worked with every day or regularly that if you had asked me before I met them in person, I would have said, "Oh, I don't think they like me very much," or "I think there's some friction there," or something. But then when we met in person, it took all of that away, and it not only took it away, but it like sustained it forward. So building relationships was certainly a challenge in that case. But I think some of the things we did as a small team helped to alleviate that. But I don't know if that made it as easy to make build relationships or build connections beyond our team boundaries. So I don't know. What do you think? Based on what I just said? How does that resonate with you, or what do you agree or disagree with?
Yeah, I think you covered a lot of ground there, and like I think that we had a lot of interest in quote unquote doing remote work, right? Or like doing it right, right? We're like, oh, we're gonna make this work for everyone. So we were kind of the tip of the spear within that particular organization as to figuring out how to do remote work. Um, but I think, yeah, what you call out as far as like broader, like scaling or like broader team things, I think is really critical, right? It is very hard. Like it's relatively easy to build those relationships with the people that you have to work with on a day-to-day basis, but there are not those auspicious run-ins, right? You don't get the full body language of interacting with people, right? As we're talking right now, right? We're literally on a Zoom call. You're a 2D bust and I am a 2D bust, right? So you can only see kind of chest up, which is, a fair amount of body language, but it's not the entirety of your body language. And it's that can make things challenging. And I think that that really drives at the necessity of intentionality when you're doing things and when you're building a remote culture. So in that, um you mentioned that when you ran into people in person, it became almost like a lifeline that sustained many more months of relationship building. I'm curious, what are your thoughts or your experiences with convening as a team in a remote context?
Oh, I have very strong feelings about that. And that's one of those things I would say to me is proof that almost no companies that were thrust into remote first world during the pandemic, almost none of them actually tried to pivot to being a remote first culture, distributed culture, and treating that seriously. Um, and that is the idea of collective time, whether that's once or twice a year. My personal feelings, I think it should probably be two to three times a year, maybe more if it's sustainable with the type of work you do and those types of things. But for a while I thought quarterly meetings would be perfect, but then I was thinking like, oh, I have to travel every 3 months, or interrupt clients or whatever. That might not be the
Mhm.
best. But yeah, I don't think I think that it's really important to meet in person because it gives you an opportunity to get past the 2D, see them in person, build some kind of relationships or connections, some body language, and I think it sustains you forward for a really long time. I This has happened a couple of times for me now. I've had just a few opportunities to meet in person, whether it's for a client kickoff for a project or whether it was with like my actual team or people I'm working with on a regular basis. And when that happens, even if it's only for a couple of days, or I think one of them was even one day. It was like we flew in,
Mhm.
had a night, and then a day, and then it was like everybody was flying out that next afternoon or something like that. But even that was enough time to build some coherence and some aspects of the relationship that we didn't establish before. And it doesn't
Mhm.
last forever. Maybe it's 3 months, maybe it's 6 months where it can sustain you and carry you forward. But yeah, I think it makes a really big difference to that. And it can, like I mentioned, it can alleviate some tension. It can help you understand somebody better. It can take away any of the signals that get mixed up over audio or video calls. Uh,
Mm,
so yeah, I think that would be a sign to me if I was talking to a company and they said, oh yeah, and at least twice a year, three times a year, we do an all hands. We fly everybody to the same place. We do activities to make sure that the teams get to work together or see each other, things like that. That to me would be a sign they really take this seriously and they care about making sure that remote and distributed work can work. Um,
mm.
so yeah, I mean, have you had any experiences like that where meeting someone in person shifted the dynamic, and like how does that relate to your thoughts on the in person time?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I have spent almost the entirety of my career as a remote employee, right? I started in the office for about a year, and then I was literally kicked out of the office because my role required me to be on the road a lot. And they said, you don't have an office here anymore. You now work from home. Because the office space it did not justify the cost. They wanted to give my office space to someone else, and I've spent most of my career remotely. And one of the things that I've noticed, I've worked primarily in the professional services industry. I've got friends who work, all across the software industry. But every professional services firm I've worked with will have some sort of periodic gathering. It won't necessarily be an all hands, but it will be a a coherent grouping of individuals, whether that's the business unit that you work in or the specific function or something on those lines. Frequently it'll be used for training, but there's always, there's a dinner, there's some sort of, doofy social activity, right? And then there's more sorts of things beyond that. And you're a captive audience, which I think is way better for those sort of social things overall. Like if you called me up on a random Tuesday and said, hey, you have to stay at work for an extra 2 hours to do like an online Zoom wine tasting with your team, I probably would rather go hang out with my family. But if I'm on a business trip and you say, hey, great, we're going to go play whirly ball or whatever, I'm probably going to be way more excited about it anyway. Cause I'm like, okay, my other option was just like go to the hotel and hang out by myself. Right. Like, yeah, let's be a bit fun. And I think, in my experience with those pieces, those, especially those kind of silly team building things, give you a lot of insight into the types of people that you work with and like what folks are when they let a little bit of their guard down. You might find out, oh, Ed is super competitive or Ed is super collaborative in a way that you wouldn't find out just in your day-to-day work. And you also kind of have these shared experiences that you can, play on at some other point. I think it helps like develop those friendships. And some kind of interesting data points. I have a few friends who work for what I would call remote first companies, and I will define that as organizations that literally do not have a home office.
Mm.
Um, and 100% of the companies that I've had friends at that are in that setup or that like I've talked to personally have a mechanism where they get some or all of their team together periodically, right? I don't think that that's a mistake. And even at one of my roles, we went through a protracted time frame where we were, implementing some austerity measures, and the first thing to go was non-billable travel, right? So internal work travel. And every team survey, the first thing that they said is, when are we going to get together as a team again? I think that those data points are important. Yes, I know that they're kind of anecdotal and perhaps a little bit cherry picked. So everyone can roast me in the comments on my choosing only data points that support my my opinion. Um, but I think that they're worth paying attention to.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I think the amount you get back from those is well worth the cost of doing it. So,
Yeah.
and I guess it might not be if you do a poor job of planning the whatever happens during the event. Which I think this is a good transition for us because we had talked earlier, we briefly mentioned this idea of meeting culture and communication. And if you bring people together in person, but you don't plan it very well, you don't have a good facilitator or whatever, it's still going to suck. It makes no
Hmm.
difference whether it's in person or remote at that point. It's still going to be bad. And the same is to be said the other way, right? Is like the reason so many people, I think these days are talking about the bad things about remote work or the things they don't like is because the things that, like you said earlier, the things that suck in person are going to just be amplified in terms of how negative they are when they're remote. So I think it's important just to mention and remind everybody that the remote things don't have to suck. Remote meetings don't have to be boring or bad. We can, if you plan them, if you put more, like we said at the beginning of all this, it's all about intention, right? How are we going to be
Hmm.
intentional about meeting? How are we going to be intentional about the time we have? So if you can be more intentional about those meetings and make sure you have the structure, maybe an agenda, maybe even creating opportunities for things to be remote async communication instead of always having to schedule a meeting.
Hmm.
Every time something happens, oh well, let me schedule a meeting for tomorrow and take more time on your calendar. Maybe there's other practices that you could use to manage your time better or use different tools to help make those those kind of things better. So um, yeah, I guess earlier you had said there's a lower tolerance for just winging it in remote meetings. Do you think, or have you ever been in a remote meeting that was better than in-person meetings?
Hmm.
Only mine,
That's a
right?
tall. Yeah, only yours, Ed. During the era of try hard Mira boards, just to be specific, so that crest has that wave has crested. Um, yeah, I think so. I think you're barking up the right tree here, and I think that there are a lot of things that are as good remotely versus in person. I think that there are certain things that are just never going to be as good remotely as in person. Think of it this way, if you sit at home and you watch a comedian on Netflix, your laughing is going to be different than if you went to the club and saw that exact same comedian, right? There's something about the electricity of people laughing next to you, right? We are human beings are inherently social creatures. There are going to be certain things that are just going to, for lack of a better term, vibe a bit better in person, right? Charisma comes through better in person than it does digitally. On the flip side, when you're talking about like hard data and you're talking about things with screen shares and whatnot, if if we're going to go through a budget meeting, I'd rather do that remotely because I've got a screen, I can zoom in, I can see everything. I'm probably not going to be able to do things the way that I want to do them in a giant conference room with you, you know, projecting an Excel sheet onto the wall or whatever the setup is, right? There are certain things that I think are better for various mediums. If you want to do a team building exercise, we probably want to be in person for that, right? Like things just they don't hit quite quite the same way.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that I think that you need to play to those strengths and not try to put a square peg in a round hole, right? Understand the limitations of remote meetings. If we're talking about culture, understand that there are certain things that are going to hit better with the group and leverage when you are co-located to do those sorts of things. There's certain things where it doesn't matter, but I think that intentionality, that preparation is key. I think on a remote call, it's just harder to BS
Hmm.
a little bit. But on the flip side, it's also easier to tune out and not get caught for tuning out. So,
Yeah.
maybe it's easier to BS because there's a higher likelihood that nobody's paying attention to you because they're all, multitasking. I don't know. I think I've just come full circle to say that I don't know anything.
Yeah. Well, I think you make a totally great point, which is it depends on what it is, whether it's going to work or not. There are certain techniques or facilitation approaches or workshops that I like to run that I have found ways to run them virtually and they're okay, but they don't work nearly as well as in person. And it's little things, right? Like, yeah, you can use sticky notes and you can still group them on a virtual whiteboard, but there is something different about the tactile nature of it or picking it up and moving it from one place to another that you don't quite get out of the mouse clicks. Or one technique I'm thinking of specifically, one of the strengths of it is that you have all these people in a room together, and as they're building the thing, small discussions are happening. You can't
Hmm.
really create space for small discussions naturally. You can do it with breakout rooms or things like that, but it's much more forced or planned. So some of those organic
Structured
things,
and a little inorganic.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm even thinking just from like the facilitator standpoint, I've run a bunch of trainings and I've done some of them remotely, I've done some of them in person. And especially when you're talking about things that can be multiple day events, right? So if you're doing like, a PI planning or like an actual certification training course, people are gonna zone out a little bit during the day. You're gonna see that kind of like eyes glaze over. And remote, right? Regardless of how good your culture is, as far as like camera usage or like mics on, mics off, whatever, people are going to turn off their camera when they get a little bit disinterested. But you don't know, like, are they turning off their camera or are they just sneaking in a bio break? You don't really know. So it's super rude to be like, Ed, I saw you turned off your camera. What do you think about this? But in a real room, if you're tuned into the room that you're facilitating, you can see like, oh, Ed's eyes are glazing over a little bit. I'm going to call on him and I'm going to invite him back into the conversation
Hmm.
right now. Right. And you can use some of those things or some like the teaching from the back of the room things within that. Whereas doing those sorts of things distributed, you're kind of just like a person in a room talking to a screen, right? Like it's a bit more lecture and a bit less like group cohesion.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and connecting to that, Zoom fatigue is a real thing. I think early on in the pandemic, I don't know if I would say we were guilty of this because I never felt like it was a problem back then, but I've definitely seen some places that are guilty of this. Always on, it's always a video call. Camera always has to be on, no matter what the topic is. And there's a lot of, I mean, firstly, it's the like seeing yourself, which of course I've got myself,
Hmm.
in a couple spots on the screen, which is distracting and
Oh, I'm
so it
so
makes,
self-conscious.
yeah, it makes you
My hair looks
self-conscious.
good today, right? Like I.
And being on camera, there's something about this that feels more formal um,
Mhm.
sometimes than just meeting in person. And it, yeah, it's just sometimes you do have to think about like what are we trying to accomplish and what do we actually need. Do maybe we could do this as an audio call, maybe that would be good. Maybe we can just do it in Slack or Teams over typing and that would be good
Mhm.
enough. But then on the flip side of it, I've worked in environments where no one ever has their camera on ever. It's just like not part of the culture at all. And even if I am in that culture and I put my camera on, no one else follows suit. Or
Yeah,
even
pretty
if,
soon you turned your camera off.
oh yeah, yeah, because I don't. Why would I be the
Yeah.
only? I'm taking up the full screen. It's kind of awkward, and I don't know that there's anything inherently wrong with that, but it is just one more thing to be really mindful of. Is
Hmm.
it's there's no one right answer. It's a spectrum, and we just have to make the right decisions for what's going to work in the setup that we have. And I think another point that relates to this is that idea of um, we talked about in the office, you can check somebody and, oh, you have a quick conversation in the hallway between meetings or things
Hmm.
like that. But also in an office, it's a lot easier to rely on tribal knowledge. Um,
Hmm.
just walking over and asking somebody for help or, oh, I don't know who to get in touch with. And it's like, oh, it's actually this guy. And like point over three cubicles and it's like, oh, it's just right over three aisleways in the desk space or whatever. Um, and when you don't have that in a remote environment, sometimes it can be really hard to get anything done. And I think that's,
Hmm.
fundamentally, this is a problem that faces organizations regardless of in person or remote. But you need to have, since most places don't have documentation or very updated documentation, you need to make sure in a remote first environment that everything is findable, searchable, organized that in a way that makes sense. I know we like team topologies a lot, and they've got their
Hmm.
whole idea of a team API and who are these teams working with, and how do you get in touch with this team, and what is this team working on right now, and what are they going to be working on coming up, and having that in a central repository to make sure that um, that everything's there and that it is findable. Uh,
Hmm.
and so my experience is most companies seem to treat documentation as a nice to have. And I'm curious, like, what have you experienced with that? What are your, what do you think most companies get wrong or get right when we're talking about managing knowledge, both in
Yeah.
person and shifting to distributed teams?
Documentation is the worst and the best. Um, Especially from a change management perspective. So I'll date myself a little bit. Um, I remember when I was working at a group and SharePoint first like became a mandate. It became a thing that you were supposed to do. There were no teeth on the mandate. It was just we put our documents in SharePoint now instead of on our local. And I was working in a role where I was creating a lot of presentations and budgets and whatnot. So I had a lot of documentation, but I had it all in folders on my local, and thankfully it never came back and bit me in the butt. Now I keep zero things on my local, and the first thing that I'm always looking at when I work with a new organization is what are the naming conventions, because I know what I like to name things, but Ed's not going to know what I like. Ed doesn't know that I like to name things by putting the entirety of the date, as in day, month, 4-digit year at the end of each document, especially when I have running documents. So if I'm doing a budget week over week over week over week, I will do it. It'll be, Ed's budget, and then it'll be the full date, but there will be no punctuation on the date. It'll just be a series of numbers that looks like a serial number. You don't know that, so you're not going to know. Like you're going to have to decode my things, right? So I think some of it, like you know, the idea of like a team API or the team topologies things, I think is great, right? I think an even simpler thing or like a lower hanging fruit is just having naming conventions per function, right? If you're in a software development organization and you do, product requirement docs, having a naming convention for that product requirement doc, or agreeing that you have a single repository of truth, right? So we're not creating things in Google Docs and then recreating that same thing in Confluence later. Well, which one's right? Right.
Mhm.
So making sure that you build those structures, that you have a single source of truth, and then naming conventions that are ubiquitous. And then if you're linking out, making sure that those links live in that single source of truth and get updated, and making sure that you set things up that way. Um, and it's hard. It's so hard to maintain. It's so hard to build the culture of building it right the first time. Because what happens is you hire from everywhere. Everyone brings whatever their culture was from wherever they were before, and then you have to somehow homogenize all of that. So
Mhm.
I think it's a really critical piece. I think that it's something, especially as a leader, you need to kind of nip in the bud and sort of be a bulldog about, like, hey, Ed, um, none of your folders are named correctly. We do it here this way. And this is the reason that we do it this way. It's for searchability, it's for scalability, and really getting to the why of that. Otherwise, people are just going to be angry and be like, you're just being a pedant. Like, it's not
Yeah.
super helpful.
Yeah. I was, a really cool approach I saw to this, and this was a bunch of years ago now, so they may be doing something way more advanced than this. But I went to a DevOps conference, and there was a team that was talking about how they handled onboarding and
Mm,
what they had done. And this is well before the AI craze and all of that stuff. But they had basically built a chatbot to help automate onboarding. And so it was something where a new person would join the team or the set of teams that were influenced by this, and their manager would just send a command. Once their account got created in, I guess it was in Slack, their manager would send a command to this bot, and then it would trigger, and the bot would send the person a message. Hey, welcome. We're getting you onboarded. Here's your first step or whatever. And in some cases, they had integrated it with the ServiceNow or whatever tooling they were using, so that the person could just either the bot would submit all of the requests if there was no information that was required for them, or the person would basically give the bot the information, and then it would proceed for the next part of the onboarding. And they talked about how, as problems came up or as they identified new things that people needed to be onboarded for, or be able to request access, or common questions, those types of things, they just kept updating and enhancing the bot. And it got to a point where, if you needed, how do I figure out how to, update some infrastructure as code, something, they would even have like quick references and contact information and things like that built in. So I think those kind of approaches can be really cool. But it does take a lot of work. And that reminds me of, I had a director many years ago who would always say, like we would talk a lot about how a lot of engineers, they want to focus on coding or whatever. And his big thing was the work is the work, but reporting on the work is the work, and documenting about the work is the work. So from his perspective, and I feel like I definitely agree with this as more time has gone on, is you have to build in time and capacity and an expectation of documentation being reviewed, revised, edited, updated, created. Sometimes those need to be acceptance criteria as part of the work, where the story is not done until that's there, or the larger body of work isn't there. And so there is, again, intentionality around making sure that you that you're doing this the right way. So I guess before we close, did you have any other thoughts?
I think you're spot on. I like that idea that, like, all of it is the work, right? It's kind of if a tree falls in the forest, nobody's there to hear it. Does it make a sound? Like, as applied to work, and I think that's really critical for us to also think about, as leaders, as workers in the workforce, that all of the work that we do is the work, and it's all valuable, right? And I think it's worth remembering that just because it's not the sleek, sexy thing doesn't mean it's necessarily not a valuable thing to do. So don't become jaded, but also don't be too proud to do the work that needs to be done. Right? The people who are successful are going to be doing whatever it is to get the job done. And that's an ethos that I think is really, really important to bring with you on a day-to-day basis, to say, hey, whatever it is that I need to go do to get this done, I'm going to go do that thing. I'm not going to ignore documentation or ignore the things that I think are uninteresting as part of this project, as part of this work item, because it's all there for a reason, right? And if it's there for not a reason, then your new work is managing the change management to remove that thing from the workflow. Ideally not with a chainsaw. End rant.
Cool. I think that's a good place to wrap it up for today. So today we talked about why remote first isn't just about location. It's about intentionality and communication, collaboration, and culture. We covered why relationship building takes more effort, how meeting culture needs to adapt, and why documentation is more important than ever. And of course, we talked about why even remote first companies still need to invest in in-person connections. So for you listeners out there, as you think about this, ask yourself, what's one thing you can do this week to improve communication in your remote or hybrid work environment? So thanks for exploring leadership with us today on Leadership Explored. If you found value in this discussion, please subscribe and share it with your network. We release new episodes every other week on Tuesday. Join us next time when we'll be back with more insights on leadership. Until next time, keep leading with intention and purpose.